Welcome to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name is David Wheatley. We're here to talk leadership in small, bite-sized and practical chunks. Enjoy. Welcome to this episode of the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My guest this week is Ray Arata, who is an author and leadership consultant and the founder of the Betterment Conference. And we may hear a little bit more about that as we go. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Well, so your book came across my desk and your book is showing up, which I want to get to shortly. But given the fact that most of my audience probably has limited familiarity with your name, that's nothing against you, of course, but give me the 20 to 30 second bio of how you got to be who you are.
I don't know if I can do it in 20 to 30 seconds, but the shortest version. Yeah, that's the shortest version is in 1999, I experienced a double whammy wake-up call, a divorce and a business partner betrayal. I had a financial services retirement plan consulting business in Silicon Valley. And after languishing sideways for 6 months, not knowing how to process this, my financial manager called me into his office, gave me some tough feedback, similar to my wife's feedback, that had me realizing that I needed to make some changes. And I said, thank you for telling me that. I needed to hear it. And he handed me a brochure that said Men's Weekend on it. And I'm like, what the hell is this? And he smiled and he winked and he said, it changed my life. Here, call my wife. She'll tell you. Well, I didn't call his wife, but on trust, I decided to do this weekend. And in the interest of time, what this weekend was an initiation into healthy manhood, a non-denominational experience that had me examine how the pain little boy in me was driving the adult bus and impacting those around me, those I loved. And this sent me on a journey, which is now 15,000 hours of working with men on how to live and lead from the heart, 55 men's weekends with the Mankind Project, maximum security work, bringing this into maximum security prisons and doing healing work in there, only to meet a diversity and inclusion consultant, a woman who was enamored with what I was doing. And my first book that I wrote in 2012, Wake Up, Man Up, Step Up, available at Amazon, by the way. Brief
Nice
little
stuff.
Shameless promotion. And she invited me to go to a women's leadership event. And she encouraged me to listen because she said, Ray, corporate America, the men specifically need to hear from you. You sound like them, you look like them. And so I went to this event and it hit me. All those times my mom told me that being second born in an Italian-American family where all the rights and privileges and opportunities went to her older brother, but not her because he was a boy and she was a girl. And then my wife, oldest of 7 in an Italian family, the youngest brother was running the business. And then my daughter, who was going to be graduating Duke with a degree in computer science. So that was my man in the mirror moment that had me start to speak at women's conferences. But after 5 or 6 of those, I'm like, this is going to take forever. Someone needs to do something. Somebody needs to do something. Well, that somebody turned out to be me. And I came up with this idea of advancing healthy masculinity into the leadership conversation. And I called several corporate heads at Price Waterhouse, Oracle, Genentech, Kaiser Permanente, and said, I've got this idea. I want to do this conference. I want to call it the Betterment Conference. And they said, sounds good to me. And with that, 150 people showed up. Michael Kimmel, Don McPherson, an African-American Heisman Trophy runner-up, former pro football quarterback. And with that, I had a conference. And here we are, fast forward 13 conferences later, 6 years later, that had me, after being asked hundreds of times by men, what do I do? Being asked by diversity leaders, how do we engage our men? And then being asked by folks that represent from historically marginalized groups, I decided to write Showing Up, How Men Can Become Effective Allies in the Workplace, to address all 3 of those constituencies. So that gets me current, and I'll stop right there.
Well, it's a different time lag in San Francisco area that 20 seconds lasts a bit longer. I'll give you that though.
Okay.
And you did mention football, but I just want to highlight it's American football as opposed to international football that your Heisman
Correct.
Trophy winner was at. There's a couple of things, because I looked through your book and you identify the states of men today.
Yes.
One of which is men are afraid to do or say the wrong thing.
Yes.
Expand on those states a little bit and what you
Sure.
identified.
Yeah. So part of the reason for the importance of acknowledging these states of men is because meeting men where they are without shame or blame is the key to everything. Otherwise, men will go into shutdown. And so the 5 states of men, after talking to hundreds of men and hundreds of DEI leaders, is that the first group is a group that uh, their position is they, what's the best way to say this? They feel like that it's their job that's being threatened by DEI. And the operative word here is their job, and that's their unexamined privilege. Michael Kimmel said, privilege is invisible to those who have it. And so this group, along with the group currently that say, like the white men that say, all this attention on us over the last 12 to 18 months is a distraction. Once again, that's their unexamined privilege in action. The second group articulates, in companies, there's ERGs for women, LGBTQIA, Latins, Blacks, etc. But what about us? That group is convertible because they're in the temporary pain of exclusion, and I can work with that. The third group, the biggest group, are the ones that are afraid to say or do the wrong thing. So they do nothing or say nothing, which signals complicity. And as Jimmy Carter said, silence is violence. And so cancel culture doesn't help, but that's a legitimate category of men. Then the next 2 groups, which are smaller, there's a group that want to do the right thing, but they just don't know what it means to be an ally or how to be an inclusionary leader. And then the last group are the advocates, the ones that are already doing this. So each of them these are nuanced, and each of these categories need to be understood and met with slightly differently.
So I was hoping that we could focus in on 2 of those.
Sure.
And so the first one being, I hear a lot of particularly white men in the world that I work in who are saying, I had no privilege. So I did everything myself. I worked myself up, brought up in poor circumstances, everything else. I had no privilege. And so they have a reaction to when they're seeing this question, or a visceral reaction when somebody like me suggests, well, that's your privilege showing. What do we do to help that group?
A couple things. First is to acknowledge their experience as theirs. And that's something that I do. Second, to help them understand the distinction between earned and unearned privilege. Because I've had many men in a room initially say that. And when they're able to understand that this thing called unearned privilege, which they didn't say or press a button, that when they came onto this earth, I want to be white and I want to be male. We call that an accident at birth. I've had people of color and women share their experiences inside companies, what they have to go through. And when men start to hear what it's like for a woman of color to walk into a room of largely white men, to find their place, or when they're in a meeting with men and men are just cutting each other off and do all these things that most men don't think of because they're not a woman, they're not of color, they just have no cognizance. And when they start to understand the fatigue and the challenge, and that isn't even bring into the picture what happens when some of these men are saying things and doing things that equate to microaggressions. Those men begin to understand, and they become awake to, wow, I've got this privilege thing. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with me. And what I try to do with these men is try and humanize it. And when I say think of privilege as akin to an advantage. If you get that it's an advantage, now you can make a conscious choice. What do you want to do with it? Do you want to be experienced by others as keeping it all to yourself? Or do you want to lend a helping hand to another human being? Most guys are going to say yes to the latter. So it requires a little nuanced patience, curiosity, and meeting them where they're at.
So, and I want to come back to that what do you want to do about it in a second, but I just want to recap there. You're saying that the earned versus unearned privilege, the earned is the work I did for myself to get myself out of whatever to get to this place. And the unearned is
the degree I earned, what I studied for, how hard I worked, all that stuff. No one gave me a leg up. I had to do it all myself. I get that.
And the unearned privilege is the stuff that's the accident of birth, which includes, you know, what gender I am,
White,
what color I am, or even what accent I have can have an impact on that as well.
I'm 6'4", so I have the tall guy privilege.
Yep.
I have I can work at home privilege during COVID, right? There's loads of them, but the ones for your white men to understand is, you know, is that being white in our country affords you privileges that being of color doesn't. Being male affords you privileges and opportunities or ease of experience that other people have to spend a lot more effort to get to the same place.
Right. So it removes barriers by an accident of birth.
Correct.
And so then the second part of that you were saying is that, you know, do I want to be somebody who's seen as whining about that, or do I want to be seen as somebody who wants to help and give? How does somebody in that position who's just starting to get the grasp of this unearned privilege then take the step to say, I want other people to have the same opportunity, without diving into your first state, which was that it threatens my job?
So if someone's just starting to become awake to this, and they're starting to be in the question of how do I want to be experienced by others, right? They can seek feedback. That's one way. Now, if they're a leader and microaggressions, unexamined privilege, and the behavior that accompanies that is happening on their watch, then how I invite these leaders to hold that is a concept that I call ownership-driven accountability. Meaning, if this is happening on your watch, like these things are happening, you need to answer, what do you have to do with it? Are you staying silent and are allowing it? Do you want to just perpetuate that and maintain an unsafe environment for everybody else who's not white? Or do you want to take responsibility and use your position and your leadership and power to level the playing field? If the answer to that is yes, then it's a function of not calling out other white men, rather calling them in and saying, hey, David, I observed some of your language and behavior. Are you open to some feedback? I've asked for permission. And you're going to say yes, hopefully, because I may have said in 3 meetings prior, I want to create a two-way feedback loop with everybody here, and no one's above or below this. So there might come a time where as everybody in to have this, let's support each other with a level of accountability. Let's just say you rose your hand, then I'd say, listen, when I saw you say this, I saw a couple body language things go on, or somebody came up to me and said something. And are you aware of the message that what you said or did communicates? No. Are you aware that when it communicates that what happens is people start to shut down? Is that what you want? No. Are you open to shifting the narrative? Yes. Yep. Right? It takes a little bit, but it's doable.
But and I like the way you put it, instead of calling them out, call them in, because the fear, and I was having a conversation this morning, is if I don't say anything, I become a target for I'm a target for the underserved, the women, the minorities. If I do say something, then I'm a target for my peers.
That's right.
Because now, and one of the challenges in leadership is the courage to do the right thing.
That's right.
And
the courage piece, David, is that third group, the ones that are afraid to say or do the wrong thing. Courage is an antidote to fear. the Latin derivative of courage is core, to speak one's mind by telling one's heart. And so in the men's work that I've been doing for a long time, most men need to be taught 5 core emotions: mad, sad, glad, fear, and shame. Because none of us were taught, if hardly any, that our emotions exist in our body. And to feel our emotions is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But most men don't get taught that, so they stuff it. And the only allowable, permissible emotion is anger. And so, and God forbid, I start talking about my feelings, I'm going to get labeled as touchy-feely or soft. That's bullshit. And so by shining light on our emotions and becoming aware of them, then one can transcend what happens with fear, which is fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so this begs another question around, for me as a white man, my white male fragility. I have the privilege of turning off the TV, not acting, and just being white. But there's a cost to that, or there's a cost to women, there's a cost to people of color. So if the worst thing that's going to happen to me is if I stand up, speak up, call somebody in, stand for equality, and I get chastised by some of my male friends, get over it. I'm not, it's not like I'm going to get killed, you know? So I really want to encourage men, and specifically white men, to breathe into that fear and have a level of courage. And, you know, maybe today we can talk about the 4 steps of the ally's journey, but sometimes us humans, we make a mistake. So if you make a mistake, own it, you know, clean it up, or if you mess up, fess up, clean it up. And I can speak to some of those rules later. That way, instead of being afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing, you'll have a way to keep moving forward. And if you mess up, how to clean it up. And that's what people who belong to target groups want.
Right.
Do your work.
Yeah. And it's always amazing to me how it's a lot easier having this kind of conversation with white men who have daughters than it is with white men who don't.
Exactly.
Because they suddenly have a visibility to, you know, I'm saying this to somebody else is saying that to my daughter, and that would be inappropriate. Right. And but I that challenge for the courage, you know, courage comes easier if you have some steps as to how to do it. And so I like your call them in, not call them out, but I'm also interested in following up on the other steps, because you know, you talk about the new rules of masculinity. And, you know, I could have this conversation with a number of my clients about maybe the old rules were better and things like that. And unfortunately, so as usual, it becomes a bit of a challenge head to head to try and say, no, there's better rules. There's better ways of doing this. And I've got daughters and granddaughters. So help me understand the new rules of masculinity and how we help the most masculine of males understand that.
So the Paul Kivel created something called the man box, those set of unwritten rules of what it means to be a man, that if you went to most schoolyards and you asked young boys what it means to be a man, you'd hear things like, real men don't show emotions, real men make all the decisions, real men don't ask for help, real men are not handicapped, real men play sports, things of that nature. Now, because I've got 15,000 hours of working with men, I will tell you, not only do those rules not work for women, they don't work for the majority of men. You could look at mental health, you could look at all the shootings across our country. Yep. It's at the hands of young boys. And that's a whole separate podcast. But be that as it may, the work I've been doing for a very long time can be contextualized as a healthy rewrite of what it means to be a man in today's world. My work started outside of corporate, and what I've essentially done is I've taken my commitment to healthy masculinity and sought to embed it into the context of leadership. So with that said, people ask me, what is healthy masculinity? And I say, well, let me speak to you around my 6 heart-based leadership principles that kept arising on my own journey of becoming a better man. And so there's 6 of them. The first is emotional literacy. Being literate around my emotions, not stuffing them, being connected to them, feeling them, healing them, not reacting, but responding. And that's really, really important when it comes to being an ally and leader, because what happens when someone says to you, you said or did something wrong that negatively affected them or hurt them? Well, if you're not aware, you'll go into shame, you'll shut down. You might get angry, you might get afraid and no longer ever say anything or do anything. That's not what we're looking for. That's just emotional literacy. Second one is vulnerability. Brene Brown speaks to that as uncertainty and risk. And vulnerability gets a bad rap. Most men think that to be vulnerable is to be weak. Vulnerability is my superpower, David, and it's a sign of strength. And in my Betterment Conferences, I've asked all the women in the room, and I say to the men, watch, if I tell you I'm afraid, if I say I don't have the answer, or I'm feeling sad, do you trust me more or less? By a show of hands. All the hands go up, just as an indicator for the men to begin to understand. Third, authenticity. Don't project this persona of what you think people need to see. Be who you are. And being an ally, if you attempt to be performative, people are going to see right through it. Fourth, accountability. Take responsibility for your words, choices, and actions and their consequences, intended or not. Fifth, inclusivity. Invite everybody. And sixth, love. What does that mean? Why, Ray, why are you saying love? Well, in my book, literally and in life, to see someone, and I'm a father, to see somebody for who they are, to hear them, to value them, to respect them, that's love. Because the person on the other side of it feels seen. So they're going to feel all of that. So when you take all of those principles, you've got a roadmap that doesn't have anything to do if you have a chiseled chin or if you're buff or not. It's just how you be in the world. And most leaders, not just men, but women can kind of take that in and incorporate some of those principles.
And it's interesting. I had a chat with somebody last week about the idea of letting go of certainty decreases anxiety. And,
yes.
And that decreasing of anxiety, that letting go of certainty, that openness to vulnerability, then suddenly opens the channels to everything else.
Having certainty, too much of it, it reeks of control, and control is simply a mechanism to counter fear.
Yeah.
So point well taken.
And we have a tool that actually has control on one end and service on the other end. And it, you know, you can ask people, which end do you want to be at? And they always say service. And yet some of their actions often lead them to the control end of things.
And that, I've never heard it put that way. And I realize control is about me, service is about you.
Well, and we'd say service is about the greater good, which includes me. Yes. I think that's what you're talking about with your inclusiveness as well, isn't it? That that control is just about me. The service, the greater good, is about us and the collective. And everything you've described there is about being more open to the us rather than the me.
That's correct.
Yeah, I love that. And so you then go from those 6 elements to, you know, some of the new rules and the sharing and share emotion. My wife will tell you I don't have any emotions, but that's probably hitting the first point. She knows
it's never too late.
She knows I do somewhere. Yeah. And so you've got those rules, but then you talk about the elements of allyship, which gets us to that group that want to be part of the solution, but don't know how. So if we've triggered anybody off of that, I'm too afraid to say anything because it's a scary environment for white guys at the moment. Yeah. To like have the courage, have the vulnerability, call people in. But now I've moved to, now I want to be part of the solution, but I don't know how. What's your tools for that?
I would invite them to adhere to and utilize as much as possible the 4 steps of the ally's journey. Now, before I walk you through those, one other thing that I've been noticing coming up is there's a lot of white guys out there that have this temptation to vilify themselves for being white. My heartfelt request is to not do that, because there's nothing wrong with you being white. It's more a function of, okay, acknowledge that you are, It's a privilege that you have that a lot of people don't. And be appreciative of it, and then seek to use it and share it to the extent you can. So now back to those 4 steps of the ally's journey.
And just before you go, it's interesting. My former life is as a police officer in London, and one of the first things I ever got to do as a cop was to go see 2 autopsies, something that most people aren't unlucky enough to go see, both of teenage boys, one of them black, one of them white. And the fascinating thing for me was the moment you peel back that tiny extra thin layer that's on the outside, everything was exactly the same.
Yes.
That's that realization. Why is that tiny thin layer such a big impact? And it's the same with gender, with race, with all sorts. We have a lot more in common than we do separates us.
That's exactly right.
But it's still hard to be an ally.
It is. And the 4 steps that I write about in my book are a framework that I use for my keynote presentations, for our conference, for our workshops, and I detail them in the book. But the 4 steps are, the first one I call acknowledge your stuff. That's kind of dude talk for be aware of your bias, your privilege,
your baggage,
these things called emotions, and the man box. Because all 4 of those things, in one way, shape, or form, if you don't shine your light of awareness, then you're walking through life unconscious and allowing those to dictate your behaviors and your language. The second step is listen with empathy and compassion. This particular step allows and invites you, not just as men, but anybody who wants to be an ally to anybody, to get interested in the lived experiences of others. And oftentimes their experiences are fraught with emotions. And oftentimes when you hear them, it will evoke your own emotions. So this notion of emotional literacy, remember when I talked about heart-based leadership? Whenever I do presentations or keynotes, I say, think of these heart-based leadership principles as cornerstones on this thing called your ally's journey. So there it is in the second step. Third step is take responsibility for the impact of your bias and unexamined privilege, and when necessary, clean it up. This step helps people begin to understand the distinction between intention versus impact. For example, I could be the most well-meaning person in the world and have a good intention, yet the impact that lands on somebody else might have a negative consequence. So if it's brought to my attention that I've done that, and I say, oh, I didn't mean it, I've just centered myself and invalidated their experience. And one of the things I teach is it's about listening from the heart as opposed to listening from the head. Listening from the head has us invalidate, defend, justify. Listening from the heart has us be curious and has us say, tell me more, and has us say, I'm sorry that what I said or did or didn't say or didn't do landed on you in such a way that made you feel afraid or sad, whatever the case may be. And then the 4th step is commit to new behaviors and actions. And so this is a lather, rinse, repeat 4-step journey that people can use over and over and over again. And given that I dubbed myself forever an ally in training, because I screw up routinely. So I have to use those 4 steps to get back in right relationship with somebody.
Which I like the way you start. One of my favorite quotes, I've quoted it on here many times before, is Dag Hammarskjöld's, the longest journey of them all is the journey inwards. That's your step 1, is are we willing to take the journey inwards and look at ourselves and constantly be on that journey inwards? And your step 2 is, are we willing to practice the right skills with people? And then step 3, are we willing to take accountability for what we're doing, saying, and when we screw up? And
that's
then
right.
Step 4, keep doing it.
Make the changes and adjust your behavior. Yeah. Andrew Brennan said, the longest journey we'll ever take is the 12 inches from our head to our heart. So variation on what you mentioned.
Yeah, there's a lot of journeys and many of them are inwards. And it's just, I see so many people on that external journey before they've done the internal journey. And every good piece of advice starts with, do you know where you're at first, as does yours. Right. So get a handle on you. So.
And the unspoken is not so fast. Take a breath and go a little slower.
Yeah. And I love that intentional listening and the listening with the heart as well. And so that then it feels like if you have that empathy and connection, you get a lot more grace.
Yes. Yes. And understanding.
Yeah. And it's about the conversations. And one of my favorite movies is the Best of Enemies, which is based on a book about two people getting together. And the more you explore and know each other, the more you get to know each other. It's amazing how much more we recognize, value, can support, and see the connections that we all have.
Yes.
Well, I really appreciate the time you spent with us, Ray. Tell us, where can people get the book? That's the Showing Up: How Men Can Become Effective Allies in the Workplace. Available all good bookstores.
Yeah. So Barnes and Noble, Amazon, etc. But my encouragement would be to go to showingupbook.com, because if you go there to buy the book, we have a goodie for you, which is a free virtual ticket to one of our Betterment conferences. And so there's instructions on how to do that. So that's how to get the book.
Okay.
Second would be, if you're interested in contacting me for keynote, facilitation, whatever the case may be, go to rayarata.com. A little bit more info on who I am and how you can get a hold of me.
Yep. And then I'll put your name in the show notes so people know where they can just Google the name and find it.
Perfect. Yep. Yeah. And then if you're able to go to bettermentconference.com, you can sign up for our newsletter. And I write blogs, and we let people know about our Betterment conferences. It's to be part of our community. So those are the three ways you can connect.
And tell us a little bit more about the Betterment Conference. Is that once a year, multiple times, one location?
Yeah, so the Betterment Conference is a one-day event that we seek to inspire, get people to think and feel differently. And it's this year, our plan is to do 2 live events that we will also stream. One in San Francisco in November and one in New York on June 2nd. We currently do not have a host venue sponsor. People are a little slow to get back into live experiences, so we might do it virtual. But be that as it may, they're great events, workshop feel, very engaging, to give people a sense of how we approach things. And what usually happens is companies send delegations. Sometimes they sponsor and be part of the narrative, and they send their learners, or they want to signal their commitment to this topic. And so if any of your listeners are in DEI, senior leadership, or HR, reach out to me, and happy to have a conversation.
Well, and I think it sounds like there's 2 audiences. One is the DEI HR folks, but the main one in my mind is the white guys.
It's men. It's men. Yeah. It's men and white guys. So we have a very broad intersectional flavor of people that come to the conference. And so I don't seek out to distinguish to the white guys. This is for men, which includes white men and anybody else who identifies as a man. And then anybody who doesn't identify as a man, they want to support and be supported. So everybody's welcome.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I look forward to checking one of those against my schedule and coming to one. Ray Arata, thank you for your time this afternoon. And I hope some people go and pick up your book, Showing Up: How Men Can Become Effective Allies in the Workplace. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, David.
That was the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name's David Wheatley. For further information about Humanergy, go to humanergy.com or check out our latest book, What Great Teams Do Great, from all good bookstores. Have a good one. Stay healthy.